Nancy's Adirondack Art presents Birch Hollow, written by Nancy McGrath.
It was a pleasant day in Birch Hollow. Most days were very pleasant and peaceful in this small, beautiful community. Birch Hollow was nestled into a cozy, mossy creek valley, surrounded by birch trees, of course, and one big oak tree. There were only 9 residents. The animal who officially established Birch Hollow was Mr. Richard Raccoon. He was a confirmed bachelor and lived alone. Richard was beloved by all because he had a generous nature and always helped anyone who asked. But the best thing he did for the community was to allow everyone to use his very extensive library. Richard's favorite thing was to read a special story aloud each evening at dusk to anyone who wanted to listen. To get to his house, you passed through a little bower under the notch of a birch tree that led to a spacious cave with several rooms. He always left his door unlocked so the animals could have access to the library, but his private quarters were in the rear of the cave, where he had a neat little kitchen, a cozy sitting room, and a very comfortable bed built right into one wall where he stayed nice and warm no matter the weather. Richard's great friend was Benny Bunny. Benny was a shopkeeper. His shop was in the big oak tree, and he always made sure that he had what all the other animals may have needed. He was very industrious and kept his shop in tip-top shape. Sometimes little Sapo Squirrel came to help Benny when he had a job too big for one set of paws, or if he had to leave to get more supplies. Benny had a nice little nest where he slept behind his shop and had his warm stove there. Sapo Squirrel belonged to the squirrel family, Mother Sadie, Father Samuel, and his twin sister Susie. Everyone spoke of their pure joy in life and how happy they always seemed to be, running and jumping through the high branches of the big oak tree as they gathered acorns or chased away any menacing birds, owls and falcons or such. They were the unofficial policemen and alarm system of the community and had always done an excellent job alerting all the animals of any intruders or suspicious activity. Then we had Sally Snake. Until she came to the hollow, Sally had a very hard time in life. She could make no friends because everyone she met was scared and ran away from her. She was a very beautiful mint green color, and all she ever wanted was to stretch out on a rock in the sun and have good conversations with a friend. One day when Richard Raccoon was down at the creek washing his supper, he heard soft crying. He looked next to him, and there on the rocks he saw Sally and asked her what was wrong. She was surprised because Richard was not afraid. They had a conversation, and he invited her to come live in the hollow, and now she had 8 very dear friends. She lives among the rocks by the creek in a soft, mossy little corner. And lastly, we have Geraldine and Ernest Woodchuck. They were well respected and revered for their age and wisdom. The woodchucks were the original inhabitants of Birch Hollow, and in their youth they had carved out a very spacious cavern on the bank next to the creek. Now that they were in their great age, the other animals took turns going to visit every day to prepare food and tidy up their comfy home. For their reward, Geraldine made the most delicious treats on the great fireplace in the center of the cave, and Ernest shared his expansive knowledge on practical matters. They were loved by all. On this particular warm and soft day, as all the animals were about their business, a strange and wonderful event took place. Benny was down by the brambles gathering berries for a special sale. He had just received some cream from a neighboring farm community, and he thought berries would go very nicely. As he was thinking of those very delicious berries, covered with foamy cream, his arm bumped into something that was distinctly not a briar. He turned to look, and to his amazement, there was an apple doll, all legs and arms akimbo, stuck in the brambles. His first thought was, I must get her out. His second thought was, I can't do this alone. I must run and fetch Richard. And off he ran. When they returned, lickety-split, the doll was just as Benny had left her. Well, well, Richard said. Where have you come from, Miss Apple? Benny, hold these branches back here, and I think I can just manage to reach her. Benny did as Richard requested, and lo and behold, out popped Miss Apple into Richard's arms. He straightened out her limbs and set her down under a pretty birch tree. "I'd wager there is some little girl who is very sad this evening." Benny agreed. "I wish we could reunite Miss Apple with her family." All the animals felt sorry for Miss Apple and made a point to visit her so she wouldn't feel too lonely. But a funny thing happened on these visits. We all know that when a toy is well loved, it gets filled to the tippity top with love. And eventually the feeling finds its way back to whoever is in reach. Miss Apple was one such toy. She was brimming with love, and all the animals felt it as they visited. And because of this, she became everyone's great confidant, and they told her all about themselves and what their hopes and dreams were. Benny confessed that even with Sapo's help, he sometimes became very tired of running the store and found himself wishing for more time to explore and rest. And even though Sally now had new friends, she still desired someone who truly understood her and knew what it was like to be a cold-blooded creature. The squirrels were as happy as pie, but they did so love to tell Miss Apple all about their brave exploits as they worked hard to keep their community safe and peaceful. They did feel a little underappreciated, but mostly happy. And finally, Mr. and Mrs. Woodchuck began to take their morning strolls down to the brambles so they could visit Miss Apple too. Ernest would help make Geraldine comfortable on a rock seat, and they would sit next to her. As they faced Miss Apple, they talked about their son Noah, who they loved very much. No one in the community knew about him because he had gone away on a fishing expedition some years ago and had never returned, and the woodchucks never spoke of it because it made them too sad. But they knew they could tell Miss Apple, and she would say just the right thing, which was nothing, and that was all anyone really could say in truth. One day Richard was walking towards Miss Apple when he noticed Sapo and his sister Susie talking to her about the barn owl, who thought he would take up residence in the oak tree. The squirrel's family didn't mind sharing, but they realized that owls were very dangerous to small creatures. They told Miss Apple about the campaign their father had launched to chase the owl away, and the part they had all played in that plan. To Richard, it all sounded very brave, and he decided then and there that their little community needed to let the squirrels know how much they appreciated them for all they did. Richard turned right around and headed home to make a medal and write a speech. He would present that medal, which he fashioned from birch bark, moss, and an acorn, at their annual spring gathering when they celebrated the end of winter. And speaking of their celebration, Benny was running around his shop making sure he had everything his neighbors would need to prepare for it. He took inventory, made a list of things he would have to go get, and took in deliveries he had ordered, all the while sweeping out the cobwebs that had gathered over the winter. One very busy afternoon, the little bell rang over the door to let Benny know someone had come into the shop. He looked up and with great gladness exclaimed, "Nephew Jack, what brings you here?" Jack went to him and they hugged. "Mother said I was old enough to go out in the world to seek my future, and I remembered your promise of a place in your store if I so desired. Well, I do, so here I am. I have always remembered my visit to you here and how beautiful Birch Hollow was, so I've come to ask if you'll have me." Without hesitation, Benny welcomed his nephew and silently gave thanks and a wink towards Miss Apple. Then there was some commotion while everyone made ready for the celebration. Sally decided that her contribution would be wildflowers, and she headed out to the field beyond the hollow, where she had seen some bright sunny daffodils. As she was gathering the flowers, she heard someone sighing great big sighs. She peeked around a clump of daffodils and saw a beautiful mint green snake just like her. "Why, hello, whatever could be the matter?" She asked the question, but suspected she already knew the answer. He lifted his head and looked right into her eyes. "I don't think there is anything the matter anymore." They talked for a long time while they gathered the flowers, and Seth helped her carry them back to the hollow. Sally took him around to meet all the others, and they were all very cordial and approving. And what might seem like a very brief courtship to you and I, to Sally and Seth it was all the time they needed to decide that theirs was a perfect match, and they made plans to marry at the celebration. Richard would perform the service. In the meantime, Seth worked at finding and fixing a more appropriate space for a married couple who planned on lots of children. Finally, the big day of the spring celebration came. Benny and Jack worked hard setting up the table that would be laden with all the treats that everyone would contribute. The squirrels ran around checking the perimeters to make sure all was well. Sappho also helped Benny and Jack. It was Susie's and her mother Sadie's special job to honor the venerable woodchucks with a pretty place for them to sit to observe the festivities. Sally was nervously preparing herself for her wedding. Geraldine took her in hand and helped her with a beautiful veil crowned with lilies of the valley. Ernest helped Seth look his best and also helped him forge the 2 tail rings that married snakes wore. Everything was ready. But before they began, Richard said they should go assist Miss Apple to the celebration. Richard, Benny, and Jack walked to the brambles. Miss Apple was not in her customary seat. They called even though they knew that was silly. They ran here and there looking for her with no luck. Finally, Jack yelled out, "I found something!" He came back and handed Richard a pretty pink piece of paper. It appeared to be a note. Richard returned to the celebration with Benny and Jack and everyone gathered together. He read the note. "I thank whoever has taken care of my wonderful Miss Apple these past 2 weeks. I have been very lonely without her, and I can see you loved her as much as I have and kept her safe for me. Gratefully, Miss Ella Ferguson." The animals had a few tears. Some were because they would miss her, but more tears of happiness because Miss Ella and Miss Apple were reunited. So they carried on with their day, and they all had a marvelous time. The squirrels put their medal of honor on the oak tree outside the door to their home. Sally and Seth's snake slithered off to their honeymoon. Richard, Benny, and Jack sat in a circle with Ernest and Geraldine. While they reflected on the day, they all heard a gasp from Geraldine. She stared across to the opening in the birches to see a dapper young woodchuck coming towards them. "Noah!" she cried. The end. P.S. So it seems, thanks to Miss Apple in part, that everyone got their heart's desires, including me, because I always wanted to be an author, and I'm the one who wrote the story, you see. Signed, Richard.